Chapter 50, A Round of Hearts. A Round of Hearts. Anomen sat, ignoring the bustle of the tavern about him as he waited patiently for the maid to come and take his order. He was the first of their group to arrive at the table and had signaled the maid not long after, but there only seemed to be one girl serving that evening and the tavern was busy, so he suspected it would be a while before their meal would be served. Though, with the way things had been last night, he had almost considered taking it in his room. They had not left the previous day as planned, not once Nalia's departure had come to light, the day spent just wandering listlessly about the town once more, and yesterday evening could hardly be described as a pleasant one. The tavern had once more been filled with music and merriment, no one in the town quite ready to end their celebrations just yet it seemed, and their table had a steady stream of patrons, people coming over just to talk with them, everyone seemingly resolved to make them feel included, more than a few young women of the town happy to provide a partner for the dancing as the band struck up. Something Herr Dallas had been more than willing to take advantage of, the man trying to convince Ari to take to the floor with him though the elf had refused his every request, just sat staring dispiritedly into her cup. The bard's insistences that some dancing would likely go a long way to cheering her, seemingly ignored.
"Well, perhaps I don't want to be cheered up,"
she had eventually snapped in sharp reply, and Anomen had suddenly realized that Nalia's leaving must have been painful for her as well as Fritha, the three of them good friends from almost the very beginning. Anomen frowned slightly. He too would miss Nalia, the man recalling her pale freckled face, the dignified air she usually carried with her never quite hiding the mischievous glimmer to her eyes. The way she strived so earnestly for what she believed was right, however her peers had derided her because of it. To have such unwavering faith in one's own beliefs. Anomen smiled wryly to himself, he was almost jealous, now he thought about it. Needless to say, Herr Dallas had given up on trying to get Ari on the floor after that, and when the next friendly young thing came over with an offer to dance, he was more than happy to take her up on it. Ari had said nothing at the time, but there was a most definite atmosphere over the table when he returned moments later and Anomen had retired soon after. It was all the greatest shame really, he considered, for Fritha would have been more than happy to provide the bard with a partner and that would have solved all the problems. But she had not been seen again since disappearing the previous morning, and the group had spent the 2 days since within the town, looking about the stalls, wandering about the park and even visiting the local temple to Joaquin. People, of course, recognized them, with the newly erected statue. Anomen felt he would have difficulty finding someone in the town who did not, merchants and citizens alike greeting them as they passed, some even stopping to talk, inquiring of their current plans, their next adventure. Some even noted Fritha's absence, though Jahara just told anyone who asked she was resting in her room, something which was easy to maintain. Whenever he passed under her window the curtains were drawn. Anomen sighed slightly to himself as Jahara finally arrived at the table with Cerned in tow, the pair nodding their greetings. Anomen hadn't seen much of the man since they had left the forests, and to be honest, he was still unsure as to what to make of him. The fact that he was a werewolf would have once been a cause for alarm, and Anomen wondered now at how readily he had just accepted it, unsure as to whether this more tolerant manner he had acquired was a good or a bad thing. As for the man himself, well, he only really spoke to Jahara and Ari, around whom he seemed to be a wholly different person, the man always ready with a quiet smile for the elf. Cern seemed to have no worries about letting anyone know of his regard for the girl, and Anomen could have derived some petty satisfaction in seeing one as suave as Herr Dallas jilted. But he had travelled with the tiefling a while now and seen his affections were more than genuine, and Anomen felt his loyalties lay with the bard, whatever their differences had been in the past. He looked over the druid now, sinking stiffly into his chair as though uncomfortable in his own skin. He had been the same last night, even now when the townsfolk were behaving more warmly towards him, treating the man as they had any of them, Jahara included, for they had always seemed to feel she had been on their side. Not that Jahara would have let it bother her even if they hadn't, Anoman considered as the woman sat down opposite him.
Ah, Anoman, have you been here long? Long enough to signal the maid, she should not be too much longer. Have you spoken to Fritha yet today? Briefly this morning through her door,
she answered shortly, seeming glad of the interruption as two more arrived at their table.
Ah, Minsk and Ari.
Cerned immediately put a hand on the back of the chair next to him, offering it to the elf, Ari smiling as she took the seat, while Minsk sank into the space next to him.
Have we ordered yet?
Asked Ari, though no one was given the chance to reply.
A good evening to you all,
greeted Herdalis smoothly as he arrived as well, taking the empty seat on the other side of Ari, though both pretended not to notice this.
Any sightings of the raven?
Jahara shook her head.
Perhaps she is ill,
offered Ari quietly. A moment of silence seemed to hold the table until...
She is not ill,
rumbled a deep voice, all eyes turning to rest on Minsk, Jahara trying and failing to hide her surprise.
You have seen her? Yes, this morning. I told her Boo was worried for her, so she let us in to set his mind at ease. She seemed very tired.
The ranger trailed off with a pained look, returning his attention to his hamster. Jahara drew a breath and continued briskly, as though to dismiss their worries as a whole.
Oh, well, there you have it then. I shall just have a meal sent up to her room.
Anoman dropped his attention to the table and said nothing. If truth be told, concerns for Fritha were not the only worries pressing on him. With the girl sequestered in her room and no sign yet of her return, the date of his test drew ever closer, with them no nearer to the city. He didn't think he could stand a few months more of this agonizing uncertainty if he was forced to wait until the winter ceremonies in Hammer, but there was no way he had any intention of voicing his concerns, to either Fritha or anyone else. If he missed it, then so be it. Anoman felt his stomach lurch unpleasantly and forced his attention back to the conversation still going on around him.
Now, I spoke to Fritha yesterday,
continued Jahara with a glance to the druid sat next to her,
and Cerned is going to be traveling with us for a while.
A murmur of welcome traveled the table, Ari looking quite pleased by this while the tiefling was infinitely less so, and Anoman suspected Herdalis was about to say something by the spark of malevolent wit he could see in his narrowed black eyes, when the maid finally arrived at their table and the moment was fortunately lost.
Right, what can I be getting for you good folk?
Jahara straightened slightly in her seat, the girl immediately focusing her attention on her.
Well, firstly, I should like something to be sent upstairs to Fritha,
interrupted Ari in greeting, and Anoman glanced up to see the girl herself weaving her way across the tavern, smiling mildly and looking determinedly well as she arrived at their table.
Hello everyone, are you going somewhere, Anoman?
She questioned, her smile taking on a bemused air, and he only then realized he was on his feet. He flushed and sat down abruptly as she sank into the empty chair next to Jahara.
Will you be needing a few moments more?
Prompted the maid politely.
No,
dismissed Jahara hastily, and she ordered their food, a more relaxed air descending over the table as they took their meal together. Fritha was clearly trying to be bright, but she looked tired for all her time spent supposedly resting, and her gaze seemed to fall on the table's remaining empty chair with depressing regularity, Herdalis making an admirable effort to distract her with talk and jokes. The bard met with failure more than success, though, and Ari, too, seemed unimpressed by his behavior, turning pointedly to begin a conversation with Cerned, though she did agree to accompany Herdalis when he asked her to join him at the bar with the excuse of getting more drinks, Anoman moving into the empty seat next to Fritha to fill the breach.
How are you, my lady.
He began quietly, feeling suddenly uncomfortable as all he had planned to say suddenly left his head. The girl glanced up from her cup, smiling faintly.
A bit tired of people asking me how I am, but ultimately fine.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared swallowed, the feelings of discomfort only growing as an empty silence seemed to swell between them, the laughter of the young men on the table nearest to them filling the void as the waitress arrived to clear their empty cups, one of the men pulling her neatly onto his lap.
Flower, you've a pair of hips no man could help but want to grab a hold of.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared bristled, affronted on the girl's behalf.
Such boorishness should not be directed at any lady, be they a milkmaid or a queen. Well, she didn't seem to mind, did she?
Said Fritha mildly, watching as the girl giggled brightly, her cheeks flushed as she batted him off and resumed her work.
Besides, for him that was probably the highest of compliments, it's not the words, ARandomAudiobookAppeared, but the sentiment behind them.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared raised an eyebrow.
So you would wish to be addressed as such, my lady? Well, perhaps not,
she conceded with the slightest of smiles,
but it doesn't stand that I would want to be pursued with poetry and torch song either. And just how would you wish to be pursued? I don't know really, it's nothing I've ever considered. Why? Were you planning to try, that you inquire so?
He didn't answer, but she was laughing for the first time that evening, and so much so, that she did not seem to notice. A tug at his sleeve caused him to turn, ARandomAudiobookAppeared's attention first drawn to Minsk, though the ranger merely nodded across the table and ARandomAudiobookAppeared followed the gesture to Johara's stern visage, the druid shuffling a talus deck and eyeing him shrewdly.
Yes, my lady. I said, do you wish to play, ARandomAudiobookAppeared?
She paused to smile knowingly.
A round of hearts perhaps?
Ari stood at the bar, eyes drifting unseeing over the shelves of bottles behind it as the landlord walked up and down serving his waiting patrons. Nalya's departure had taken her by surprise, though it did not seem so sudden to some of the others, and ever since Ari had been worrying that had she noticed the true extent of Friend's unhappiness before, she could have at least eased her burden. Ari sighed. The group had felt so complete before, as though they would always be together traveling as they did now. But Nalya's leaving had pointed out the fragility of her place in the world, and the elf could not help but wonder how long their group would last and what she would do if it did not. Return to the circus? Stay with Herr Dallas? She was not sure. In the beginning everything had felt so right, but lately she had been finding it increasingly difficult not to dwell on how little she actually felt she knew him, the man almost a stranger to her even after all that time. She had grown up believing that to find love was to find someone who completed you, that filled the hole you had not before even realized even existed within yourself. And though she did love Herr Dallas, it still always felt as though something was missing between them.
Ah, the poor raven,
began the man next to her, Ari following Herr Dallas's gaze back to the table they had just left. She has taken this all rather to heart. Ari felt a tightness just under her ribs, his obliviousness to her worries only making it worse. The bard had hardly spoken to her since their sharp words the previous evening, and Herr Dallas had been distant at breakfast, merely accepting her apology before leaving the tavern on his own business, and she had not seen him again until dinner, when he had instantly turned his attentions to Fritha. Ari thought this request to join him at the bar would lead to an apology or at least some explanation from him, but all he seemed interested in was talk of his raven. Next to her, she heard him sigh deeply.
Ah, such things will always plague those who cannot accept the natural entropy of the world. I suppose so,
Ari muttered, not even trying to hide resentment in her tone as he fell back on his usual doom-laden philosophies. Herr Dallas turned to her, looking irritatingly surprised.
What is wrong, my dove? You have been cool towards me all evening.
Ari felt her temper surge. He had been ignoring her all day.
No, I haven't,
she dismissed airily.
Besides, how would you know? You've hardly spared me glance since you sat down.
That got a reaction, the man straightening slightly to raise a cool eyebrow.
I am surprised you noticed where my eyes were, my dove, considering your attention was most fixedly elsewhere.
Ari felt herself flush, his insinuation quite clear, and she was suddenly recalled to that evening and the warm talk she had shared with the druid. She was finding the man's attention rather enjoyable, though she knew she should not be, her voice coming slightly shrill in her discomfort.
That is different. Cern is new to our group, I was just trying to make him feel welcome.
Herr Dallas sent her a patronizing smile.
Come now, Ari, this sparrow would be the first to say that the innocent air suits you, but you can use it overmuch. Last night and now this eve as well have been spent with you and Cern twittering away to each other. You may be content to think it all innocuous friendship, but you are the only one of the pair who does.
Herr Dallas sent the druid a dark look across the crowded tavern.
He favors you.
Ari bristled, cross at how the idea thrilled her and throwing herself into their quarrel to distract herself from it.
Oh, so that means I cannot even speak to him then, even when you are ignoring me. Ignoring you?
Herr Dallas repeated, looking for a moment astounded, when a darkness she had never seen before seemed to veil his eyes.
I was focusing my attention most wholly upon you yesterday, trying to cheer you with talk and dance only to be soundly rebuffed. Now, today, I tried to give you the space and time alone to grieve your loss as you seemed to want, and it is still wrong.
Ari swallowed, the tension in her chest suddenly gone, replaced by the most awful weight as she realized her mistake. She tried to form an apology, gathering the words to explain herself, but he left no pause for her to even start, his voice measured and low.
Were we in Sigil, were this sadness plaguing anyone but you or she, I would have reminded you that all things are meant to end and left it at that. But being foolish enough to try and fathom what you primes could possibly want in such a situation, I tried to cheer Fritha this eve as best I know how, just as I tried with you yesterday, and met with the same amount of success. Though at least the raven seemed to appreciate the fact I was trying, and entirely against my nature too. Ah, enough of this quarreling, I am gone.
He turned on his heel and swept off before she could halt him, her cry lost in the general din of the common room.
Herr Dallas!
Cern stared down at the 7 cards he held with not much care as to the fact he hadn't even one matching pair. Three's Bane had been decided upon in the end, a simple enough game that was better suited to their odd number of players, though no one seemed to be taking it particularly seriously anyway. Minsk was on one side of him, 2 empty chairs between them, the ranger talking softly to Boo as he awaited his turn, while across the table, Fritha and Anoman were sat, the squire playing distractedly with the Helmite symbol that hung at his neck, Fritha slumped forward slightly in her chair with a bored look. Her chin was propped upon her hand, a fan of cards lolling in the other, the girl making no attempt to hide them from the man next to her, as though she knew he would not even consider stealing a look. Cern drew his attention back to the woman sat on the other side of him. Jahara was the only one he felt was playing the game with any care as to the outcome, the woman frowning as she decided her move. She finally played a pair of 7s, Cern knocking sharply on the table to indicate a pass, the man taking 3 extra cards from the deck in the center as a forfeit as the play went on to Minsk, and the druid could once more let his attention drift elsewhere. He had been pleased when Jahara had informed him she had spoken with Fritha and he was welcome to travel with them, feelings that had remained even after this evening's mixed reactions to the announcement. Cern sighed. He knew he was as much to blame as anyone. He had become too used to keeping all but his fellow druids at arm's length since his infection, aware that many people who did not have the benefit of their teachings may view his condition as aberrant or even monstrous. But, as Baldur had proved, druids were just as susceptible to such prejudice as anyone, and this group had seemed to accept him without question. He really should have made a better attempt to get acquainted with them since leaving the grove. Well, what was done, and he would no doubt have time enough to get to know them over the following days. He knew of one of them well enough at least, the man glancing again to the woman next to him, the play once more back round to Jahara. She rapped sharply on the table as he had, and took another 3 cards and Cern threw 2 4s onto the pile without a thought. This was the 3rd day he had spent in trade meet, and so far all had been in Jahara's company, though the first had been the more pleasant experience, the pair walking out into the forests and almost reaching the northern hills before they had turned back. She was a quiet woman, not in any timid way, but the druid clearly deemed small talk a waste of time and energy. The silences between them were not uncomfortable though, both enjoying the world about them in quiet reflection, and when she had spoken, she had done so without any reticence, answering all of his questions about her recent travels and companions. She had spoken of a husband too, though from the phrasing Cern could tell he was no longer among the living, and he had pressed that subject no more. Yesterday day though, after its dramatic start, had found the woman seemingly content to just wander trade meet with the others, though he suspected she just did not want to leave the town with Fritha upset as she was. That had been the only thing Jahara had seemed unwilling to talk about, the woman giving all the appearance of her previous openness when he asked about her young charge, but skillfully redirecting his questions whenever he had tried to delve deeper. As for his 2 days spent within the confines of trade meet, it had been bearable. That the townsfolk no longer watched him like they expected him to show his true colors at any moment was a welcome relief, but he had been living outside civilization for a while now, and he was still finding the differing rhythms of urban life jarring. He had better reaccustom himself to it quickly though, for although they would most likely be leaving the town soon now Fritha was back among them, the group's planned destination was a city 10 times the size of trade meet. Athkatla. It had not been so long ago when he had called the place home, and yet it felt like another life to him now. Cern felt an almost animal panic quiver low in his stomach but quelled it instantly. It was another life, and one he had given up without any shame or regret at the time. There was nothing to be feared in a return. "Three's Bane," announced a voice at his side, and Cern glanced up in time to see the group sigh, Jahara proudly laying a pair of 3s before them, everyone muttering crossly as they took it in turns to take 3 extra cards. Cern glanced back to the bar as play resumed, easily finding the pale gold head he had been seeking, Ari and Herdalis still at the bar, though it was not surprising they had yet to be served, the pair far more focused on arguing with each other than catching the attention of the landlord. Cern frowned slightly, the elf's face twisting with distress as the bard made some, no doubt, cutting remark. He had sensed an unnaturalness in Herdalis from the beginning, Jahara admitting he was a tiefling when he had asked, and though that was not the reason for it, Cern felt the pair were ill-suited as a couple, one so bright and natural, while the other seemed to revel in the darker aspects of the world. He smiled as he recalled the brief time he had spent with the elf so far, their talks in the swamp and then again during their evenings together in the tavern. Ari was pretty, and very naturally so, and it would have been easy to hold a regard for her on that alone. But it was as he had spoken to her that his regard had truly grown, the girl quite warm for all her appearance of shyness, with a keen eye for the natural wonders that could be found all around them and a pleasant curiosity for all she saw. It would have been hard not to feel a regard for one such as her, and it was not his desire to suppress such emotions either, such feelings as natural as drawing breath, though at the same time Cern knew caution would have to be exercised. She was with another at that time, and he did not want to upset the balance of a group so soon after joining it. There was a season for all things, and a deep belief in the natural order was in his very blood. All would work out as it should in time. A polite cough started him from his thoughts. Jahara had noticed him watching the girl, and he turned slowly back to the game.
Do they always argue so? No, not really,
the woman answered after a pause, and he could tell Jahara disapproved of his interest, though it seemed she respected him enough not to voice it, merely adding,
they seemed quite sure in their affection for each other until now. But if you are looking for arguments, Fritha and Anoman are your pair. A day they don't find something to quarrel about is the day the sun fails to rise.
Cerned recognized his attention was being redirected and glanced over at the pair sat opposite, the girl looking at her cards, the man looking at the girl, and both frowning slightly. Cerned was about to make some comment as to them getting on well enough at the moment, when a shrill cry of Herr Dallas caught his attention, and he glanced up with the others just in time to see the bard storm past the table, leaving the elf alone at the bar.
Ah, if you would excuse me,
Cerned began to the table as he rose.
Three's bane,
said Fritha, sending him a pointed look as she lay a trio of eights down before her, and his cheeks still felt hot as he arrived at the bar. Ari sat on one of the tall stools there, her head resting desolately upon her hand.
Ari. What? Oh, I'm sorry, Cerned, I thought, oh, I don't know what I thought.
She sighed, frustrated, and he was struck again by how young she seemed, as though she hadn't been given the chance to grow up in her own time.
Please do not be distressed, Ari. I can fetch one of the others if you wish to talk to someone. Jahara, perhaps.
For a moment the girl's face wore an incredulous look, and he wondered what he had said when she just shook her head.
No, I am fine, just cross with myself.
She drew a deep breath and released it slowly.
It will pass.
Cern said nothing. He did not trust himself to speak without bias, and after a moment, she continued, turning away from him to face the bar.
Herr Dallas, he is just very different. From you. From everyone.
She corrected passionately, whirling back to him before she sighed, smiling wryly.
And I always seem to expect him to behave just like everyone else. He is so different from anyone I have ever known. It was one of the reasons I first liked him. And now?
Cerned prompted, though Ari seemed not to hear him, staring off into the middle distance.
He was just trying to help,
she began cryptically.
I don't know why I didn't see it. What can I get for you, miss?
Came a voice before them, and they both turned to see the landlord stood before them expectantly.
Oh,
Ari stammered, before quickly recovering to rattle off her order, the girl turning to him as the landlord bustled off.
Could you wait for it please, Cerned? I should.
Cerned nodded and she smiled, and he watched as she returned to their table to stand behind Fritha's chair, the girl straightening politely in her seat as Ari greeted her, and the game continued on. Fritha's attention split as the pair talked genially. Anoman downed the remaining ale in his cup, the last mouthful slightly too warm to be pleasant, and he suppressed a grimace as he swallowed, setting the tankard back on the table before him with a sharp snap. The women had retired over an hour ago, Fritha leaving not long after Herr Dallas had stormed out, Jahara and Ari going soon afterwards, and what little life to the table there had been seemed to go with them, Minsk and Cern staying only long enough to finish their drinks before they too had retired, leaving Anoman alone. Not that he particularly minded. He had had much on his mind since he had been given the date of his judgment, and he welcomed the solitude in which he could mull things over without the worries of appearing unsociable or brooding. His test was coming, and though before he had believed he could not have borne it if he had been forced to wait, now he was not so sure. Those extra few months he had previously considered an agonizing term, now looking like something of a reprieve. Anomen thought back to the last time he had stood in the great hall, the dark eyes of his mentor looking back at him, grave and unreadable as he had explained his decision to allow Reynold and his brothers to go free. Sir Ryan Troll's attitude had not been a hardening one, and yet Anomen still felt now as he had then, that he had taken the only possible course for a truly just outcome. Anomen shook his head. Everything he had once been so sure of had been turned on its head in the space of only a few months. Was he, too, like Reynold and the others? Losing his way without even realizing it. Perhaps that was why he had sympathized with them. Anomen shook his head again as though trying to scatter these doubts. He had to be more sure of himself, have more faith in his own heart, just as Fritha had said. And for a moment he was back there, sat next to her on the grass, the girl laid beside him, so serene and contented. Perhaps that was what she had been driving at on that morning in the grove. There was a strong possibility the Order would not accept him, a deep disappointment, undoubtedly, after all his hard work, but what would truly change in his life or indeed the world at large? He would still travel and fight for righteousness as he had been, he would still be the same person, with the same values. He would still have a place in the world, and, as Fritha had rightly said, there would still be trees and sunshine and the other small pleasures life could afford. In the end, failing his test would only ruin as much as he allowed it. Of course, it was hard to distance yourself from the judgment of men whose approval you had been seeking since you were a boy, but Fritha thought he was worthy. And the thought awakened a tiny grain of hope within him, not enough to banish the overwhelming sense of self-doubt Anomen felt, but it was there all the same. Poor girl. Her melancholy that evening had been hard to bear. He had been so ready to return the words of solace she had offered him when he had been grieving for his sister. But as soon as he had spoken to her, he had forgotten all he had meant to say, and before he knew it, they were playing cards and there was no more opportunity for talk. Anomen wondered what she was doing now, just sat in her room alone, as she had been all day? The thought was unbearable.
"Will you be wanting another drink, Lord?"
came a voice at his elbow, the maid from before arriving to clear away his empty cup.
"Ah, no, thank you, miss."
He would just knock and ensure she was well, Anomen decided as he rose, perhaps invite her to walk out if she seemed composed enough, for he had always felt a lot better when occupied in the first few days after Moira's passing. Anomen was on the 4th floor and outside her door before he had realized it, a hand held poised above the wood when the soft murmur of female voices halted him. He let his hand drop back down to his side, feeling instantly foolish. Of course, the other women would not have left her on her own to brood. Anomen sighed, turning to continue on to his own room when something inside halted him. He should knock anyway, let Fritha know he was there for her, even if it was predictably redundant. He felt his reluctance surge instantly. The man stood before the door wrestling with himself while the sound of her voice alone rang out in the stillness beyond it, the others no doubt listening with anticipation. He still felt as though he was fighting for every breath as she stared down at him again, when something clicked.
"Feelings,"
he croaked, his heart suddenly back where it should be and twice as fast.
"Yes, my feelings for you,"
she confirmed, looking slightly puzzled, before realization seemed to slowly dawn.
"Did I not mention that part first?"
And before he could reply, she dropped to her knees in front of him, as a cleric before an altar, and in a voice both soft and grave.
"Reduced to listening at keyholes now, are we, Nightling?"
came a voice behind him, and Anomen jumped, whirling round to face the smirking figure of the tiefling. He narrowed his eyes as the bard brushed past him to rap smartly on the door, Anomen barely suppressing a laugh as he heard a chorused groan from the other room and a familiar elf cry,
"Whoever it is, get rid of them."
A moment later and Jahara appeared at the door, her face unusually pink, the druid rolling her eyes at the sight of them, both crowded in the doorway.
It is for you, Ari, and you, Fritha.
They both appeared a second later, just as flushed, Ari slightly wary while Fritha looked mildly interested. The bard led his lady further along the corridor for a little privacy, but Fritha had no such concern and stood in the doorway, the watchful eyes of the druid behind her.
A problem, Anomen? No, not as such, but Cern and Minsk have retired for the evening and Herr Dallas is.
He paused for the word, murmuring and a soft giggle floating along the hall to fill the silence. The women before him shared a look. Anomen coughed self-consciously and continued on.
Well, I was wondering if you wished to walk out. It is a fine evening.
Well, Fritha began, glancing back into the room to Jahara, who silently raised an eyebrow.
I'm afraid we're reading at the moment. Don't start again without me.
Came a plaintive cry from along the corridor and the two women smiled to each, Fritha turning back to him with a shrug.
Looks as though we're free. Come on, Jahara, I'm not leaving you here to read ahead.
The woman smiled wryly and obliged her, leaving for her own room as Fritha swung a cloak about her shoulders and stooped to pull on her boots. Anomen frowned slightly, he had not expected Jahara to wish to come as well. Outside the air was sharp, the cloudless sky holding no heat from the day, and stars glittered above them as he and Fritha waited for the woman. Fritha was well wrapped up against the cold in coat and cloak and gloves, her cheeks already glowing as she watched the way her breath hung frozen in the air. Saturday alone in the tavern, his worries for the future made it almost hard for him to breathe, but just to be stood next to her and it was as though they held no more substance than her misty breath. She was so real, so alive, her mere presence seemed to reassure him. He couldn't quite put the feeling she gave him into words, though for reasons he couldn't fathom he suddenly felt compelled to try.
Fritha.
She glanced to him and his throat seemed to close, a considerable effort going into forcing himself to continue.
Fritha, you're out here,
announced Jahara abruptly behind them.
Well, let us be off then, it is cold just stood.
They set out, he and Jahara walking side by side in silence while Fritha amused herself by starting on the wall outside Viatrice's place and trying to follow their route without touching the ground. Why she insisted on behaving so childishly Anomen would never understand, though he found himself keeping an eye on their path and its suitability for her all the same. But however round about their route, they eventually turned into the main square and Fritha abandoned her game with good grace, dropping lightly from some railings to join the pair. Anomen sighed to himself. He had hoped to speak to her, but it was growing colder and they should be returning to the inn.
Well, our walk is done,
began Jahara, confirming his predictions, though her next words were quite unexpected as she continued.
Wait for me a moment while I go into the forest's edge to pray, it is a fine night. Be careful,
Fritha called after her brightly, Anomen still almost unable to believe it as he watched the druid fade into the darkness.
Come on, Anomen, we can wait over here.
Fritha moved to the nearest wall, sitting to pat the space next to her and he complied, watching as she took off her gloves, putting one set of fingers into her mouth to breathe on them. He raised an eyebrow and she smiled.
Poor circulation,
she explained, using the moment of reply to change hands, and he smiled slightly as well, gesturing for her to give him a hand.
Goodness, you'll give me chilblains.
She laughed, her hand icy in his as he wrapped both of them about it, rubbing briskly.
Helmsbeard, you are cold. Where is your scarf? I would not have thought you would be without it on a night like this.
Her smile faded, Fritha's face taking on a carefully neutral expression.
I lost it in the swamp.
They both knew she was lying. He recalled noting how well she had looked in it the previous morning.
Truly?
Anomen confirmed nonchalantly, indicating for her to change hands.
I thought I saw you wearing it yesterday.
Fritha looked up at him, her expression unreadable and, for a moment, he thought she would just dismiss it, when
I gave it to Nalia. I'm sorry, Anomen, I should not let this make a liar of me.
She sighed deeply, shaking her head.
Ah, she is gone and I'm at such a loss with it. I can't embroider for remembering all the stitches she taught me. Half the books we bought now lie half-read, I can't finish them knowing I won't be able to discuss them with her, though I cannot dwell on it like this. And besides, she is not gone forever. Perhaps once I have Imoen back I can go and visit her. She could even have her lands back by then, she'd be so happy.
Fritha trailed off, smiling absently as she pulled back her hands and replaced her gloves.
It is so strange. She has hardly been gone a day and I feel it so keenly. I try to imagine what she is doing now, reading to the children or embroidering perhaps. I see her at a window, looking southwards into the darkness as she sews, a single candle burning brightly next to her. It reminds me of a poem I once read. I close my eyes and imagine the dark hills I would have to cross to reach you.
The girl was gazing off in the direction the druid had disappeared, though her eyes were looking at something far beyond the darkened streets, and Anomen swallowed, feeling slightly uncomfortable.
Have you ever thought to write any poetry, my lady?
He inquired finally, glad for anything to break the silence.
An account or two of your travels, perhaps?
Fritha glanced to him, looking mildly surprised he had asked.
Me? Oh, not recently, though I must admit to writing a few when I was younger. Gorion and Imoen seemed to like them well enough. Truly? I would be intrigued to hear them. Oh, I can barely remember more than the titles now, though I'll have the notes kicking about somewhere, I suppose. Let me see.
She considered aloud. There was Ode to the Last Biscuit, a clamshell's worth of Oceanus, and that epic saga of friendship and betrayal.
Imoen, where's my blue hat? I know you had it last.
Anomen smiled slightly.
I suspect my lady is not serious. Fritha is completely serious, though she admits her poems may not have been.
They both laughed at that, the sound of it ringing in the cold air before it faded away to a silence, the night still save for the chatter of the fountain and the sound of distant singing for Compline in the church to Joaquin. So, began Fritha eventually, turning to him, her young face grave in the half-light,
you have been summoned back to the city and your future within the order is to be decided. That is so, my lady. What do you think they will say?
He shrugged, dropping his gaze to his lap, his hands feeling empty now hers had gone.
I do not know. But I have done all I could have done, the decision is theirs now. So you are no longer worried then? No.
He answered slowly, but she leveled an even look at him and he smiled sheepishly.
Well, yes, but not as I was. It will be a crossroads in my life whatever the decision, but I can see each path could lead somewhere worthwhile. I would be disappointed not to join the order, but it would not mean the end of my life. Well, I think that's a very sensible way of looking at things,
she said with a nod, glancing up at some noise, and he looked up as well to see Jahara's shape slowly emerging from the darkness.
All done,
called Fritha, and the woman smiled.
Yes, and cold to my bones. Come, we should return to the inn.
Ari led the way into her room, the sounds of the others making their plans in the hallway outside suddenly muffled as she shut the door, the silence of the room somehow tense as Herr Dallas waited expectantly behind her. She had been so happy to see him arrive with a gnomon before, and yet frightened as well, worried that he would still be angry, that perhaps she had broken something that could not be fixed. But he had been as mild as ever he was, instantly putting her fears to rest as he jokingly told her it was too cold for him to spend any more time outside sulking and asking if he could speak with her alone, and that had brought them there.
"I am sorry, my dove,
he began as soon as she turned to face him, though Ari swiftly cut him off.
"No, please don't say anything, I am sorry, I was being argumentative and silly. I don't know what was wrong with me. I've been unhappy about Nalia leaving and it has made me, I don't know."
She sighed, shaking her head as though to make sense of the jumble of thoughts within.
"I'm sorry, Herr Dallas. I did not want to quarrel with you this evening, I just feel so frustrated sometimes, so worried about the future and what it holds for us all, then you say things about everything being destined to end, it just made me angry, I suppose."
Herr Dallas sent her a sad smile, putting an arm about her to plant a kiss on her forehead.
"Oh, my dove, do not fret, I will never leave your side if I can help it."
Ari nodded, suppressing another sigh.
"Sometimes, I just get so exasperated, with myself as well as you. I didn't understand what you were doing today, how you were trying to help, I just thought you were ignoring me."
Herr Dallas almost laughed.
"And why in the plains would you think that, sweet Ari?" "Well, you rather were, Herr Dallas,"
she reproached, feeling her assumption had not been entirely unreasonable,
"and, well, I suppose since I told you I no longer have dreams of becoming an actress, I've been thinking about how little we actually have in common. I sometimes feel that we are not so well suited, we are so different, the way we look at the world, and I worry that over time it will come between us." "Perhaps,"
he conceded after a pause,
"if we let it."
Ari sighed, feeling as though she was swimming against the tide.
"I suppose. But other couples, they fight and make up and struggle and grow closer, and we just seem to always stay the same."
She wanted him to agree, to finally acknowledge what she had felt for a while now. That, however close they seemed to grow, there was always something between them, constant and unwavering, that seemed to stop any deeper connection from being formed, as though the man could only let her so near to him. But Herr Dallas just sent her a measured look.
"Perhaps it only seems that way when you are looking at it from inside."
He smiled faintly, a teasing lilt coming to his voice.
"You seem to spend a lot of time searching for problems between us lately, my dove. If I did not know otherwise, I would say you were getting bored of this sparrow."
Ari felt her heart jolt, an unbearable guilt welling in her stomach as she saw the unspoken question behind the half-smile. Before she knew it, her arms were thrown about his neck, pressing him to her.
"No, no, that is not so. Oh my Bard, my love, do not think that, never think that. I love you, I do, with all my heart." "Good, I am glad,"
he smiled as she released him, though it did not quite lift the guarded look to his eyes.
"And I would have you know that your feelings are returned and most ardently too. Well, it is late and Jahara will no doubt be marching us back west in earnest tomorrow since we are already a day delayed. I should retire."
Ari felt awful, the weight of it pressing on her until she was almost sick with it. She just wanted to be close to him, but whatever she did, it still felt as though something was missing. She swallowed dryly. There was only one final step that could be taken now. She sank slowly onto the bed behind her.
You don't have to go."
The room suddenly seemed darker than before, the lamps throwing deep shadows across the walls. Herr Dallas stared down at her, his eyes almost black in the half-light, the silence between them broken by shouts and laughter of people somewhere in the street below.
"Ari. I mean, you could stay.
She reached a hand up to take his sleeve, all her focus on the neat linen cuff as she smoothed a thumb over the embroidery there.
I want you to stay.
End of chapter.